Good evening. My name is Louis Branscombe. I'm Director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program in the Kennedy School Center for Science and International Affairs, and your moderator for this evening's discussion of U.S. technology policy. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening the principal architect of that policy and three knowledgeable people to provide their own perspectives on the issues. And we will proceed as follows. I will introduce our speaker and our panelists after a few brief introductory remarks. After Dr. Bromley's remarks, each panelist will have a few minutes to comment, perhaps frame an issue to guide and focus our discussion, maybe ask a question. Dr. Bromley will have an opportunity to respond to those three remarks, and then I will invite you, the audience, to come to the two floor microphones, one of which is here, one over there, and enjoy and become a part of our conversation. I do ask you to ask your questions from these microphones because otherwise we lose your audio from the videotape which is customarily made of these proceedings. We will adjourn when we have either exhausted the subject or 9:30 has arrived, whichever comes first. Our discussion tonight is about the role of science and technology in the nation's economic health, and more specifically, whether the federal government should try to enhance the comparative technological advantage of Americans who are increasingly challenged by sophisticated firms in a global economy. For those of you who don't believe that the U.S. administration has a technology policy, I will share with you one of the best kept secrets in Washington. Here, in fact, it is. And it was transmitted, it has the White House seal on it, and it was transmitted by Dr. Bromley to the House and Senate Appropriations Committees and was available to anyone who asked for it last September 26. At that point, it disappeared without a trace. Now, it's well known in Washington that any high-level document that is marked top secret, eyes only, will appear in the press the next day. But if one marks the document released for public distribution and mails it to the chairman of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, you can be sure no one will hear of it for weeks. Thus, tonight, we are especially privileged to hear from the principal author of this policy and the artful architect of the White House consensus behind it. In my own opinion, this document signals the beginning of the end of a fruitless debate about the merits and dangers of industrial policy. It also signals the beginning of a search for a rationale for directing some part of the government's annual investment of $70 billion in R&D to strengthen the technical base of American industry. In one sense, of course, our government has had a de facto technology policy for years. The decision not to articulate the policy is, of course, itself a part of the policy. But it may be more helpful to note that during most of the 4 decades since World War II, there have been two clearly visible elements of science and technology policy. The first, usually called science policy, acknowledges the necessity for federal support of basic research in science and engineering on the grounds that basic science is a public good, in which firms underinvest because only a fraction of the value to the economy as a whole is appropriable to the firm. There's a widely shared conviction that basic scientific knowledge will, in its own good time, result in a broad range of technical options of economic importance, even occasionally creating whole new industries. The second acknowledges that science and technology are powerful tools for the fulfillment of the missions of federal agencies, such as defense, space, and energy, pursuing projects managed by the government in the national interest. Associated with this mission-driven justification for research and development is the belief, or at least the hope, that some of the government's massive R&D effort will rub off on commercial industry and contribute to its competitive capacity. Under pressure to help U.S. industry to cope with increasingly strong foreign competition, the administration and the Congress have begun to explore how they might depart from these two secure areas of political consensus. The discussion has shifted from a debate about R&D to a debate about technology. Industrial competition is not only a battle for innovative product ideas, but a quest for the quickest response to market expectations for high quality and low cost. Technology embraces all of that. R&D addresses primarily the front end, scientific principles and product design. Sematech, for example, is a technology project, for it addresses the perfection of production tools for semiconductor manufacturing. Historically, the federal agency missions called primarily for R&D. Production volumes for government products were usually small by commercial standards, and little emphasis is given to process technology. Thus, as the idea of commercial spin-off from government procurement began to lose its appeal as an antidote to Japanese and German penetration of historic U.S. markets, the nation began a search for economically sound, managerially practical, and politically acceptable means for government to contribute to the commercial industry's capacity to compete technologically. In short, a quest for a satisfactory technology policy. Our panelists tonight, in the order in which they will speak, are Professor Ashton Carter, President Linda Wilson, and Mr. Robert Kutner. Ashton Carter, Ford Foundation Professor of Science and International Affairs, is the director of the Center for Science and International Affairs, in which the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program is happily embedded. A graduate of Yale with bachelor's degrees in both physics and medieval history, his doctorate is in theoretical physics from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. His career has taken him from Oxford to the Office of Technology Assessment, to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, to MIT, and to Harvard. He is the author of several books on arms control and international security affairs, and for tonight's topic, it's particularly relevant that he is one of 5 co-authors of a book in preparation here, tentatively titled Beyond Spinoff, Military and Commercial Technologies in a Changing World. Linda Wilson became the 7th president of Radcliffe College on July 1, 1989. Formerly vice president for research at the University of Michigan, she is a graduate of Tulane University and holds a doctorate in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin. She has made many contributions to science and technology policy, particularly as it relates to cooperative relationships between universities, government, and industry. A charter member of the Government University Industry Roundtable of our Academy of Sciences, she has served as a senior advisor to many government agencies, most especially the National Science Foundation. Robert Kutner is a journalist with a syndicated weekly column in the Boston Globe, appearing also in the Washington Post and many other papers. He was an honor student in government at Oberlin College, earned his M.A. in political science from Berkeley, where he was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. Mr. Kutner covers economic affairs for the New Republic and has written for many other publications. We're pleased to welcome him back to the Kennedy School, where he was formerly a Kennedy Fellow in our Institute of Politics. Last Sunday's New York Times Book Review has a long and I think quite favorable review of his latest book, The End of Laissez-Faire, Plug, Unplug. Hot off the press just in the last few weeks. This book is very relevant indeed to tonight's topic, for he describes how the normally pragmatic American approach to government's engagement with the private economy yields periodically to a quest for the utopian purity of an economy governed only by market forces. Thus, he may be able to help us understand the extraordinary power of the words industrial policy to strike fear into the hearts of congressmen and bureaucrats alike. Now I invite you to give your attention to our featured guest, Dr. D. Allen Bromley, Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. Born in Ontario, he attended Queen's University and received his doctorate in physics from the University of Rochester. He joined the Yale faculty in 1961 and was for many years the distinguished director of Yale's A.W. Wright Nuclear Structure Laboratory. A member of our National Academy of Sciences, a former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, he has served his university, his profession, and his country with extraordinary generosity and dedication. In October 1988, presidential candidate George Bush encouraged the scientific and business communities by pledging that if elected, he would elevate the Office of Science and Technology Advisor to the same rank as the director of the NSC and empower the Office of Science and Technology Policy to become an effective instrument for helping the president manage the scientific and technical dimensions of policy issues and ensure the vitality of the American scientific and technical enterprise. He was as good as his word. Dr. Bromley, an acquaintance of the President for many years, has revitalized the office and has demonstrated an extraordinary talent for gaining the cooperation of operating agencies and earning the respect of senior White House staffs. He has balanced the roles of team player and independent advisor about as well as anybody could, and has, in only 19 months, restored the effectiveness of his own role as advisor and that of the Office of Science and Technology. Among other accomplishments, he successfully steered a 17.5% increase in the NSF budget through the 1992 White House machinery, for which all scientists are appropriately grateful. And he will speak on national technology policy. Can it help make American companies competitive?
Thank you, Lou. It's always a great pleasure for a veteran member of the Yale faculty to show up in the land of the Crimson. Having both a daughter and a daughter-in-law who are graduates of this great institution, I know what a marvelous education you provide in matters scientific. I do, however, admit to certain questions about the English department. One of my graduate students at Yale a number of years ago, who today is a distinguished international figure in physics, began the first draft of his thesis with the following memorable sentence after exposure to that department. Quote, "This field of research is so virginal that no human eyeball has ever set foot in it." And just to give equal time, I tried that on a colleague in biology in my own alma mater, and he said, "I have one of those too." And the sentence is as follows, quote, "In spring, a bird's gonads swell and fly north," which paints a graphic of somewhat painful picture. Tonight, however, I'm not here to talk about either physics or English, and I want to talk about something that's in between, namely technology and the use we make of it here in the United States. Technology and the science from which much of it springs are of enormous importance to this country, and my office, as Lou has said, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, is devoting rather remarkable amount of attention to this question of technology, as is the Bush administration in general. Over the last few months, I think all of us have seen in rather dramatic fashion the difference that modern technology can make in the military. Just a few evenings looking at television makes that graphically clear. Science and technology have an equally dramatic effect, perhaps not as obvious, on the civilian economy and on our modern way of life in this nation, and that's one of the things I want to talk to you about tonight. The past investments that we have made in science and technology in this country have represented an enlightened point of view on the part of our Congress and through the Congress on the part of our taxpayers, and the payoff has been as real in the civilian economy as was obvious in Desert Storm, and there is no reason to believe that that will not continue and in fact accelerate. There have been a number of recent studies of the economic payback of research and development. I won't mention them in detail, but I do want to give a particular thanks to Professor Ed Mansfield of the University of Pennsylvania, because I remember all too many occasions when I have waved my arms and given anecdotal reasons why the payoff for research and development was high and something that everyone should support, and all the professional economists said, "What the hell else would you expect him to say?" And now we have a paper from Ed Mansfield that after a study of 97 industries in this country in 7 industrial sectors demonstrates to the satisfaction of professional economists that the return is 28%. and that is a number that I treasure and use frequently. And I think that it is important, however, to realize that although we use this question of economic return frequently in our arguments for the support of research and development in the nation, that it is vitally important for us to remember that there are other returns that are equally, perhaps even more important. Science and technology, over the lifetimes of those here in this room tonight, have immeasurably improved the quality of our lives through treatment of disease, greatly enhanced mobility, improved accommodations and food, better recreation, entertainment, I hope. And we tend to forget that just 100 years ago, a quarter of all the people born in the United States were dead before their 25th birthday, and half of them were dead before their 50th birthday. And today the corresponding figures are 3% mortality by the age of 25 and 10% by the age of 50. And finally, and I think most important of all, certainly to me, is the fact that scientific discovery is the greatest adventure that is accessible to the human species. And that, I think, after all is said and done, is one of the major reasons why we support science and technology in this country. It is also true, of course, as Francis Bacon made very evident in his famous quotation from his religious meditations, Nabit ipsa scientia potestas est, which we translate clearly as knowledge itself is power. And since I went to Washington, I learned that when Senator Everett Dirksen first heard that marvelous quotation, he added, particularly if you know it about the right people. Now, much has been written, much has been spoken over the last decade about the fact that America is losing its edge in technology, even in areas of science. Personally, I believe that much of that talk is, at best, ill-informed. We in the United States continue to have, by a wide margin, the strongest science and technology enterprise that the world has ever seen. And we should not forget that fact. What is true, however, is that other countries, by focusing their resources, by focusing their activities, have been able to move up in narrow sectors to equal us, and in some cases to surpass us. But this should in no way be frightening. It shouldn't be surprising. It's precisely what we expect, as other economies have developed and built up with our help, in fact, since World War II. What we must keep in mind, however, is that in those areas where we do not define the frontiers, we must be sufficiently close to those frontiers so that we are in a position to exploit, without delay, new discoveries wherever and whenever they are made. Let me mention just a few strengths of the American science and technology enterprise. It's important to keep that in mind as we look now, as I shall in a moment, to U.S. policies affecting technology. First, this country has the strongest research university system that exists anywhere in the world. This is particularly true at the graduate level, more selectively at the undergraduate level, but our universities continue to set world standards, and we demand more of them than does any other country. We demand not only new knowledge, but we demand trained young minds that can use that knowledge in new, innovative, creative ways. And the United States also continues to have a business climate that encourages formation of new companies, allows successful companies to grow quickly into major enterprises. One good example of that is in the area of biotechnology, where over 400 new firms were established in the 1980s alone. But there are a great many other examples. And it is important for us to recognize that also unique to this country is the fact that these small companies, the entrepreneurial startup companies, are responsible for a wildly disproportionate share of the new innovations, of the brilliant new ideas that establish new paradigms. They also are responsible for the creation of a wildly disproportionate share of the new jobs in our society. And as long as capital investment remains available to nourish these entrepreneurial activities, I am convinced that these companies will continue to provide a dynamic aspect to American society that is simply not available elsewhere. Finally, I think it's important for us to recognize that the U.S. has an open and a restless society that prizes and rewards innovation. And there's no question that today our world is changing. It's the hallmark of our age, and it's changing at an accelerating rate. And those companies that remain innovative and flexible are those best able to take advantage of the changes that are taking place. And it's important for us to recognize that the massive production lines for which the U.S. became famous can no longer be looked on as any guarantee of success. There will still be certain advantages to scale, but much more important, we need flexibility, agility in changing our production capabilities, both to reflect technological change and to reflect consumer demand. And we must be much more sensitive than we have been in the past, particularly to this question of consumer demand in the international marketplace. We have far too long had the feeling that eventually those folk in other countries would catch on that what we were doing was what they needed. It is not true. Now, these strengths and the opportunities that they represent, I believe, are all represented in the budget that President Bush presented to the Congress at the end of January of this year. To take advantage of the really remarkable opportunities that our successes over the past decade and more have made available in the United States, the President has requested an 18% increase in the funding for the National Science Foundation and a 9% increase within the National Institutes of Health for the funding of research carried out by individual investigators. Together, these two institutions represent something over 75% of the total federal funding of university activity in the United States. And by focusing on these, it has been our effort in the administration to strengthen the role of the individual investigator, to redress an imbalance which we recognize has developed in recent years in our funding of research in this country. But at the same time, I think it's very important for me to emphasize that there has been far too much whining in the community, and there has been far too much emphasis on the needs and rights of the individual. What we should indeed be doing instead is emphasizing the tremendous opportunities that are out there, that are unexplored, that have enormous potential for a return to the taxpayer, to the nation. That we have people trained and waiting to exploit those opportunities, but that we don't have adequate funding to make it possible for them to do that. If we take that point of view, I believe the Congress will respond, and respond generously. But if we take the point of view that there is some kind of entitlement involved here, we in fact have just the opposite effect. And this is a very important point, and one that I would ask your help in bringing about, because we have been moving too far in the opposite direction. Having talked about basic research, let me quickly emphasize that that is certainly not the only component of a nation's R&D enterprise. Japan, for example, has been able to move forward with really dramatic effect without substantial investment in basic research. They have been able to exploit basic research wherever it is done more effectively than we have. And this is the stage of the innovation process the stage between the generation of new knowledge and its effective use in the development of attractive products and processes that poses the greatest challenge to us at the present time in the United States. And to help in that process, the President's budget has funded a number of new initiatives that specifically address our application of the new developments for which we are responsible. One that I would highlight, for example, is high-performance computing and communication, but there are others: energy technologies, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing and materials, and aeronautics. Let me turn for a moment just to this question of high-performance computing and communication, because I can't think of a single other initiative that has the promise of greater impact on our society, and an area where we have leadership at the moment upon which we can build. The program that the President has adopted as one of his major initiatives in this year's budget was developed by an interagency program organized through my office. It focuses on hardware, on software, on networking, and on the human resources that will be necessary to improve our capabilities over the next 5 years by several orders of magnitude in speed and capacity. Our goal is to double the federal support of this area over the next 4 years. In my view, this can have a return that is extraordinary in what we can do in terms of expanding the capability of small businesses, expanding the capability of our research enterprise, and perhaps most important of all, changing the structure of education in this country. Because it is now true that with a single fiber optic coming into a classroom, every student in that classroom can receive individualized instruction, self-paced, with repetition where required, and reward when that is appropriate. And this can revolutionize education, and God knows we need revolution, particularly in pre-college education, where our present system is scandalous. In addition to all of this, the budget emphasizes a number of areas of applied research and development. In fact, it states specifically, and I quote, that increased funding is provided for, quote, all major civilian applied R&D areas. And this is an important measure of the administration's intentions. In a recent speech to the recipients of the National Medals of Science and of Technology, the President said, and again I quote, "Today our government must help carry basic research forward and contribute to the development of generic technologies that build on basic discoveries. If America is to maintain and strengthen our competitive position, we must continue not only to create new technologies, but learn to more effectively translate those technologies into commercial products. In this way, we can help leverage the R&D of the private sector, helping whole industries advance in an increasingly competitive global market." And this represents a major commitment and a new commitment on the part of the Bush administration to working with the private sector in the development of these technologies and in the development of our technological strength. Let me turn then to the question of technology policy. The question really at issue is, will this support of technologies automatically boost the American economy? Or, to return to the published title of my talk, can federal support for technology development help make American companies competitive? And there's no question that in some cases it can. History provides many examples where it has, ranging from the airline industry to the computer industry. But even though a strong technology may be a necessary condition for economic success, it is by no means a sufficient one. Our past strengths in technology have not prevented erosion of American market share in industry after industry. Now, I don't believe that the federal government should try to directly identify and develop technologies for commercial products and processes. I remain convinced that that's a process for the private sector, and past attempts on the part of the federal government to second-guess the private sector have produced dismal results. There are very real limits on what the federal government can do, and in fact this was indicated in a recent poll conducted by the Industrial Research Institute among its members, who consist of the top-ranking research and development officials in the leading commercial organizations in this country. The members were asked to rank 5 major factors which, according to them, contributed to the erosion of U.S. industrial strength. And the 2 most important categories were, quote, general management practices and, quote, external financial pressures. And way down at the end of the list was federal technology policy. And as the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, this ranking leaves me in a somewhat awkward position. In fact, I sympathize with a tale that's told about Newton Minow when he was head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, in the 1980s. As many of you remember, it was Newton Minow who coined the memorable phrase "a vast wasteland" in describing commercial television. And what Minow reported was that one day, shortly after he took up his job in Washington, his mother called him and said, "Newton, since you've been in the job there in Washington, there's no question whatever, the television programs have improved. But can't you do anything about TV dinners?" And the problem is that there's a very real limit to what we can do in a great many areas. One of the problems is that we define technology policy too narrowly to simply the government's support of technology. As Lou mentioned earlier, last September, after what can only be classed, I suppose, in the Chinese sense as an interesting activity, we managed to get complete approval from all branches of the White House to release a report entitled U.S. Technology Policy. And it certainly was our goal in that report to take a much broader perspective. We consider such issues as technology transfer, the financial environment that's required for longer-term investments, the legal, regulatory environment necessary for innovation, and finally, and certainly not least important, the education and training of an adequate workforce. And what I'd like to do with the rest of my time here tonight is to simply talk about a few of these issues. First is the question of getting solid information about where we stand with respect to technology. That is more difficult than you may think. Some of the analysis has been done and is being done by the private sector. I know that a number of groups here are looking at these issues, and I had a fascinating discussion this afternoon about a new book that's about to be released on an unsuspecting world. And these reports, I can tell you, all of the reports from this organization are read extremely carefully in my office and have been extremely helpful. One of the other activities that's currently underway at the request of the Senate Appropriations Committee is that we have been working on a critical technologies report, which is going to the President tomorrow. We have been asked to identify the critical technologies in the United States. The panel that has been brought together has 13 members, 6 from the private sector, 6 from the federal government, plus the panel chairman, who is my associate director, Bill Phillips, associate director for industrial technology within my office. The panel has selected 22 technologies that it believes will be critical in the 1990s and in the early years of the next century. They fall into 6 broad categories: materials, biotechnology, manufacturing, information and communications, aeronautics and surface transportation, and finally energy and the environment. And the report describes each technology, highlights its importance, the reasons for its selection, discusses the current status of that technology, including the relative position that the United States holds in that area with respect to the rest of the world. And as the report points out, the development of technologies, like the development of science, is replete with surprises. Who would have guessed, when the laser was developed, for example, that today it would be used in homes throughout the world to play music, or that it would be reading prices in supermarkets? And what the panel has done is to set forth the technologies that they, with some confidence, believe constitute the appropriate bases for exploitation to satisfy the immediate future needs of this nation. And this list, of course, will be updated biennially to ensure that it remains current. And of course, as all of you know, one of the sad features of most reports that are generated in Washington is that they sink without a ripple. And I would, of course, want to debate with Lou that the U.S. technology policy has left just a tiny ripple somewhere, but most of them do sink without a ripple. And so to avoid that horrible fate for the Critical Technologies Report, the Senate, in its wisdom, has chosen to give my office the funding for something called the Critical Technologies Institute, which is now in the process of being established. It will give us something we have not had in the past, namely the capacity for longer-range strategic analyses of major issues. Most of my staff are caught up on an hourly basis addressing crises, and the only way we do any thinking at all is to hide out for a day every 2 weeks in some unspecified location outside of Washington to think. It's a novel idea. But it actually works. Many people recognize that Washington is in fact 69.2 acres surrounded by 62.2 square miles surrounded by reality. And from time to time we have to make contact with that. Now, the question of how best to develop technology application is a critical one. And it has been given scant attention, both in the public and private sectors. And we in the White House frequently meet with senior representatives of major U.S. industrial groups. And a great many of them come in to tell us that they're in trouble in terms of remaining competitive, and many would like to see some direct federal assistance. But all too few are prepared to lay out the strategic programs that they would intend to implement, supposing the assistance were made available, that would put them on a new trajectory so that 5 or 10 years from now they would be healthy, viable, and would not need another transfusion. And this is one of the major problems we have in this nation, that strategic thinking is all too rare. This is one of the very important roles of the institution in which we find ourselves this evening, and others like it, because long-term strategic thinking of why and how we as a nation should be proceeding is terribly needed. Now, the administration is prepared to be helpful. We are very much interested in input on these areas, but again, let me emphasize that we do not believe that economic transfusions in the absence of strategic plans are any answer at all. Let me mention a few areas outside of OSTP that I think are important. The Department of Commerce has been very much involved in some recent activities that I think are very important. Through the National Institutes of Standards and Technologies, which all of us here recognize as NBS, announced last week the first set of its new awards under a $36 million advanced technology program. We think of it as a pilot program. If it's as successful as I believe it will be, you can look forward to dramatic increases in its scope in the years ahead. In all, 249 proposals were received, 45 were joint ventures, 204 were single applicants, and 183 were from small businesses, and they came from 38 states plus the District of Columbia. And these were subjected to 678 technical peer reviews involving 395 individual reviewers. Obviously, I got the press release. And out of this screening, 11 winners emerged, and I was tremendously impressed by those winners. The awardees span an entire range from large multinationals like IBM and AT&T to very small companies with less than 100 employees. And they span a tremendous range of technologies, from X-ray lithography through panel displays to machine tool control, non-volatile computer memories. And in all cases, the non-federal matching in the program exceeds 50%. So by all measures, I think this is a successful program and one of which we will build. Next question that we take up is that of technology transfer. The federal government spends something over $20 billion a year in 726 national laboratories. We don't need 726 national laboratories, and that's something we will do something about. But they embrace an astonishing breadth of know-how, technology, expertise, personnel. Many of them were established right after World War II, and their missions have tended to evaporate. But our challenge is that of bringing this group into active participation in the frontier activities of the nation. And I believe that one of the important ways we can do that is to make sure that the universities and the private sector are involved together with the national laboratory people, not just at the output, trying to find out what to do with some marvelous technology that is presented at the end of the process, but rather at the beginning of the process where the resources are allocated and the decisions are made as to what activities are of greatest importance for the nation. And we are making, I think, major progress on that. But I want to emphasize, before leaving this topic, that technology transfer probably represents two of the most damaging words in the English language, because the implication is that you can identify something as a technology, you can wrap it up at point A and move it to point B, unwrap it and have it work. And nothing could be farther from the truth. I am absolutely convinced that the only way in which technology transfers is in the minds of individuals. And what this implies is that we must vastly improve the mobility of individuals among the major sectors of our society. Now, I think that it is important that we really build on this idea of a partnership. We've talked about it, God knows, long enough. We've talked about a partnership between universities, between an industry, the federal government, but the translation of these ideas into actual practice has been remarkably deficient. But then I would remind you that translation is always a somewhat difficult and hazardous business. And let me illustrate with an anecdote that was told me recently by Guillermo Soberon, who is the science advisor to the President of Mexico. It seems that a Mexican bandit had knocked off a small bank in southern Texas and had escaped back across the border with a Texas Ranger in hot pursuit. And in due course, the Ranger caught up with the bandit in a small village just south of the border, but there was a problem. The bandit spoke only Spanish and the Ranger only English. And so in time-honored fashion, the Ranger selected the oldest, wisest-looking individual in the village who could speak both languages and deputized him as a translator. And the first question asked was, ask him what his name is. And the answer came back, he says his name is Jose. And the next question was, ask him if he admits to robbing the bank. And the answer was, yes, he admits to robbing the bank. The third question, ask him where he hid the money. The answer, he refuses to answer. So the Ranger whipped out his pistol, put it to the bandit's head and said, try again. And at this point the bandit in very soft Spanish said, I hid it in the village well. And the translation came back immediately, Jose says he is not afraid to die. And so I merely illustrate the point that you must be sure that your translator has the same agenda that you do. This has not always been the case. Finally, I turn to this question of education. It has been recognized for a long time that the pre-college educational system in this country is in sad disarray. For the first time in the history of our nation, our children and our grandchildren are receiving an education inferior to that which we received. And that is something that is truly scandalous. Now, the Bush administration has taken major steps to address that question. You remember that we had the Education Summit in the autumn of 1989, and we are taking active moves now to, among other things, to develop national standards. I don't say a national curriculum because that has elements of coercion, but national standards. What should students be expected to know at the completion of grades 4, 8, and 12 in areas of science and mathematics, and how should we measure performance against those standards? It's not an easy question, but it's one toward which we're making substantial progress. This year, a committee, again organized within my office, chaired by Admiral Watkins, the Secretary of Energy, has addressed this whole question of mathematics and science education, and in particular addressed the stretch goals that the President and the governors have established for mathematics and science education. And the most ambitious of those goals, you will recall, is the one that says that U.S. students will be second to none in science and mathematics by the year 2000. And given how far behind scratch we are starting, that is an ambitious goal. But yet it is one that I believe that we can meet. We can meet if we work together on this. The committee that I've just mentioned has identified, first of all, the major area of problem as pre-college. In that pre-college area, the matter of teacher preparation. And in the 92 budget, we have requested a 28% increase in the funding, specifically for programs addressed to improvement of teacher qualifications. And so we are only playing part of the role. For the first time, I believe that both the military and the private sector in this country have recognized that for a very long time we have been unique. Our military and our business sector have assumed, with good reason, that when they needed personnel they had but to reach out and the public system would provide personnel in adequate number and quality. No other nation made that assumption. It is not clear whether we should make that assumption in the future, but certainly for the short term we cannot, and both the military, that has done a remarkable job as the world's largest training institution, and the private sector have to play an important role. And let me simply conclude. Recently, as chairman of the U.S.-Japan Commission, I had an opportunity to spend several days meeting with the science advisor to the Prime Minister of Japan, and after several days I felt that I knew him well enough to ask him the question that I really wanted to ask him, which was, why do you, sir, from your vantage point, feel that your economy is so much more healthy, at least in most evaluations, than ours? And I'm sure it wasn't original to him, but I still found it intriguing. And his answer was this: it may not be unrelated to the fact that in Japan, per capita, we produce 5 times more engineers than you do, 1/27th the number of lawyers, and no MBAs at all. And now this may be a Japanese solution to our problem. It may be entirely inappropriate to the United States, but it gives a small hint for one of the directions in which we might wish to move. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Alan. Ash, the floor is yours.
Okay, I would like to make just a few brief comments, Alan, on the narrow theme of the relationship between technology and economic performance, which was only one of the themes that you touched on, but an important one. And the first point I want to make is that we speak as though we our question, the question posed to us by Alan's new U.S. technology policy, is whether we wish to change the federal government's relationship to technology, have a new science and technology policy in the country. And my first point is that we are, whether we like it or not, in the midst of a fundamental change in the relationship, a fundamental transformation in the relationship of the government to technology, whether we choose to make a change in our policies or not. Let me give you a few symptoms of that. First one, very crude measure, but one that can be easily expressed and quantified: spending for research and development around the world. Imagine a pie, all of the science and technology spending in the Western world. Half that pie money originates in the United States. Other half of the pie money originates in the other Western industrialized nations. About half and half, U.S., non-U.S. About half of the U.S. half originates with the government. The other half of the U.S. half originates from private investors. So the government's still a big hunk. That 1/4, still a very large chunk, but one that is declining relative to the rest of the pie and has been for 3 decades. Let me take defense as an example, one I know best. A lot of people think that the Defense Department is a major contributor to the science and technology base, and it is. 1/6 of all R&D funding in the Western industrialized world comes from the U.S. Department of Defense or the Department of Energy's defense-related programs. 1/6. That's a big hunk. It's still very significant. But 30 years ago, it was 1/3. And the secular decline is continuing. So there are trends going on in the magnitude of the total world pie of science and technology that is American and that is controlled by the U.S. government. Trends, I'm not saying they're bad trends, but they are before us. And so the government's role is changing whether we like it or not. It's also the case that 30 years ago, and that I gave those first numbers in 1960, one could, to first order, consider that in high technology industry, Americans made things and sold them to themselves. That is clearly no longer the case, and that very much restricts the scope of U.S. government action to affect the economic fortunes of companies that may do part of what they do in the United States, but they may do their R&D in one continent and receive their capital in another and do their manufacturing in yet a third. And finally, there's been a change in the process, in the pressure points of the technological system leading to commercial performance. Pressure points that have shifted now, relatively speaking, from the stages of generation of basic ideas to the stages in the innovative process where the ideas are put to work and where incremental progress rather than leapfrogging is necessary for companies involved in heated international competition. So for all these reasons, we first can't say to ourselves, ought there to be a government role in technology for economic performance? There is. Big role, has been right along. We can't say, should it change? It is changing. And so our question is, we don't have the option of standing still, and we don't have the option of not intervening. So what ought we to do? Well, to my way of thinking, the thing to do is to go back to the basics and ask ourselves, what types of government intervention in the science and technology base can we justify? Justify on the grounds that private investors will not invest adequately in it because they can't appropriate the benefits. Justifiable because the investments needed are too large for private investors, too risky for private investors, won't pay back on the short term that private investors require, are central to the development of other technologies. And last, if they're going to be funded with American taxpayers' money, are in some sense advantaging Americans, not as against others around the world, but certainly equally with others. We need to go back to basics and look at this area, this gray area in between basic research or the generation of fundamental knowledge and product development, the traditional job of the private sector and say, what is the appropriate federal role? We just have no tradition that we can lean on, and that's my second point. The U.S. government is not organized to recognize the importance of science and technology to the economic enterprise. It's not for a very good reason I'll return to shortly, but you all know that R&D in the U.S. government is organized by mission agencies according to their public missions, and it's nobody's job in Washington, particularly except Alan Bromley's and the very small advanced technology program in NIST that he mentioned, to worry about science and technology for economic performance. And in that vacuum, and given the needs I described, what you see happening is a lot of stuff of questionable merit tunneling through the system and getting done. I'll give you one example, and I don't mean to say there's no merit in this thing. I'm going to mention Semitech, Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Institute, but let's be honest, this was not culled from some wide set of possible projects. The system was hot-wired to produce the funding for Semitech. It tunneled through the system, and while it may have some merit, we can't be sure that the next program that tunnels through is going to have merit, and we need to have we need to give some kind of order to this process, or to use a phrase Alan used early in the evening, this is going to be the biggest pot of pork in the Western world. Let me close with one note about the opposition to the whole idea of technology policy in Washington. Alan, to his credit, got this report called the U.S. Technology Policy through, and I would say that 90% of the value of that report is in the cover, and the other 10% in the... Not to say the content isn't good, but to say that the whole idea of technology policy was a big idea. Now, why is that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that there are a lot of economists in the administration who think science and technology is just another input to the economic engine, and thereby, I think, miss a lot of the subtleties of the technological process. Second, people don't like the idea of the government picking winners and losers because it will pick as many losers as winners. In the phrase of Sylvia Ostry, it's also the case that losers pick governments. That is, once you get a project going and there's a constituency, very hard to stop. But I want to also say that I think some of the blame has to go to the technical community in this regard, which lacks credibility in those circles because of projects, and I'll name a few. The space station, for example, which exhibits great cost growth, little cost discipline, and just seems to be paying for the NASA centers. Semitech, HDTV, things that tunneled through the system. Endless R&D projects like fusion energy, strategic defense initiative, and so forth. And I don't mean to criticize all the technical content of those programs, but collectively they create a picture of a community that is not policing itself. And we all know that those projects are in some ways not science and technology projects to begin with. But the point is that there's a certain hostility to the technical community and a fearfulness that opening this door of technology policy will be a Pandora's box. So let me close by congratulating Alan on the technology policy, which I think really is an achievement, and nothing I've said is something that is unknown to him. But I think we have a long way to go to make sense out of this idea and not either fail to rise to it, which would be a terrible mistake, or to continue to slop along in the way we've been.
Thank you, Ash. Linda Wilson.
Let me start by saying that I think we need to make a choice as to whether we are in a zero-sum game, a positive-sum game, or a negative-sum game, because the strategies that one must follow are really very different depending upon which one of those scenarios you're in. Because of some of the work that Alan has mentioned, particularly the work that Harvey Mansfield has given us about the remarkable average annual rate of return on investment in academic research, namely 28% per year, it seems to me that we should be choosing our scenario as a positive-sum game. We may have to, from time to time, adapt a few of the strategies of a zero-sum game in order to get the discipline that we need to use that positive sum wisely, but basically I'm optimistic. I think, though, that what we will have to count on to assure that we stay in a positive sum game situation is what has been a major feature of Western industrialized nations, namely that we've been very good at institutional innovations. We've been very good in creating institutions and in having them change and evolve effectively for times of major transformation. And as Ash says, we are very definitely in a major transformation. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not business as usual. We're at the beginning of a new era. Now, if we look at institutional innovation and we look at some of the driving forces for that, we can pick up from Alan's comments that part of it is coming from our increasing global interdependence and our increasing understanding of our global interdependence. And we can look at the demographic changes in our own country and in the mobility of peoples within the world, both in terms of immigration across the seas and the mobility that will be taking place, particularly in the European community in the coming years. And it seems quite clear that, to me at any rate, that the institutions that we presently have, most of which have been designed for a particular kind of people, will have to rethink some of their design features if they are going to operate very effectively with the changing population that will be in their workforces and in their the new entrants at the beginning and the leaders at the top. As the president of a women's institution, I'm particularly interested in taking note of the ways in which most of the institutions and organizations in our world were designed principally with men in mind. And while I don't hope that they will be transformed to be designed only for women, I do have in mind that a lot of the design features don't work as well for either women or minorities or people who come from rural backgrounds, and we need the talent that lies within those people. Now, to deal with those social transformations, it seems to me that we need to have some discipline and go about it at least somewhat analytically, although we, of course, cannot ignore the political dimensions of this. I think it would be a very useful exercise to stop and think about the particularly valuable design features of our institutions. For example, those of our academic research enterprises, those of the American science and technology enterprise, and try to locate the problems and pressures and tensions that we now feel to see where they intersect with the particular design features we have. If it turns out that all of the problems fit squarely between design features that we care very much about, we can see that we're in balance with and in an equilibrium. My hunch is that we will not find that, but that we will identify problems that could be solved by adjustments in certain of the design features. We also need to think about whether our metaphors, the way in which we couch our strategies, are right for the situation that we have at hand. In this country, we have been very fortunate. We have gained much from our competitive strategy, and we use our sports metaphors very frequently. We think mostly in terms of a winner and other losers. Our whole talk these days about the American competitiveness internationally is still in this metaphor of wanting us to win and the rest to lose. The reason we're in a winning position is in large part because the rest of the world was devastated after the Second World War, so this is a rather hollow victory. Indeed, what we're finding as we talk with the science and technology leaders in other countries these days is there is a real convergence in our strategies, that we are finding ways in which we need to cooperate and collaborate and other ways in which we need to compete. But this country does not have a very good analysis of when to compete and when to collaborate, and that's a major shift that we will have to make. Finally, I'd just like to say that we are making some progress in institutional innovations. One is the Government University Industry Roundtable at the National Academy, which Lou mentioned in the beginning, a forum which is designed particularly to avoid this problem of important reports dropping without a ripple. It involves leaders CEOs of companies, presidents of universities, sitting leaders in the science agencies, and what they do is design the agenda and steer the committee to discuss a lot of urgent problems, but they do not make decisions. They are a body which guides the dialogue and stimulates the dialogue so that the decision makers are influenced. I think the Critical Technologies Institute is another version of a new way of approaching things, an institutional innovation. My worst fear is that we won't have the will or the discipline to be systemic in the kinds of transformations that we make, and that we will miss the boat because we don't stick with our strategies for more than a year or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Mr. Kutner?
Well, I read the technology policy report fairly carefully, and it seems to me that Dr. Bromley, although he uses language that's very carefully qualified, is something of a splendid heretic within the Bush administration, and I want to be very careful not to love bomb him out of a job here in Cambridge. But I think if you look at the controversy over industry policy or technology policy or industry-led policy or civilian DARPAs or whatever euphemism you want to come up with, and you look at the way it was by and large blown away by Messrs. Darman, Sununu, and Boskin et al., Bromley is either very deft at this, or as a scientist he's you know, allowed to indulge these heresies because scientists are rather eccentric and they don't have much influence, and if Murren and Costello and Fields embrace this sort of thing, that's a real threat, but the president's science advisor, well, that doesn't matter. I'm delighted that he's done this, because I think that there is a kind of spurious dualism in much of what has been administration policy of markets good and policy bad. Whether or not the government admits it has a policy, it has a policy. And if it doesn't admit that there's a need for a civilian or a commercial technology policy, then by default the only policy is military, and the only technical advantage that's created is in spheres where you happen to get spin-offs from the military. Now, also I think the notion, both in the report and in Dr. Bromley's comments at dinner, that government has a role to play via technology policy, in this case through pre-competitive research on generic enabling technologies to advantage American industry, that's also somewhat heretical, because the very concept that there is such a thing as American industry is heretical. Boskin, in a famous line, was quoted as saying, computer chips, tortilla chips, potato chips, they're all chips. It doesn't matter if you produce X quantity of output, one kind of chip is as good as another kind of chip, and I don't think Dr. Bromley believes that. It seems to me that there is a desperate need in our technology policy to acknowledge that there is such a thing as a set of national economic goals, that if you don't civilianize some of them, then by default the Pentagon becomes the closet Ministry of Planning, and that trade-offs exist between geopolitical goals and commercial goals. The whole export control program, the whole concept of dual-use products is a very telling example of that, in which one branch of the Pentagon, with a concern for what is called the Defense Technology Base, incubates wonderful new technologies that serve defense purposes. But the contractors who produce the products that use those technologies cannot, as a matter of economics, exist solely as wards of the Pentagon. So they go out and use applications of these technologies and products that have commercial markets. And then another branch of the same Pentagon, which doesn't talk to the first branch because it has a different mission and it's located in a different building, and it's in an entirely different flow chart, swoops down and nips the ability of the same producer to commercialize the same technology in the bud for fear that it might fall into the wrong hands. And so you have products like supercomputers that were incubated in the defense establishment, which are not allowed to be sold on world commercial markets freely for fear of what might happen to them, and you end up killing the industry in order to save it. I think unless it is explicitly acknowledged that the country has commercial technological goals as well as military ones, these trade-offs are never addressed. The same thing is true of trade policy, where ideology says that our system goal for the world is to promote the freest possible markets, to set a good example by limiting government involvement in American industry. And as a result, we often fail to pursue our national self-interest in areas where we do have advantage, such as advanced technology, for fear of seeming mercantilist. And a good case in point is the low priority which was accorded the protection of intellectual property in the recent trade round. So I think if we don't have an explicit policy, we nonetheless end up having a policy by default. And I think it's wonderful, even if it's a little bit heretical, that and even if the office can't quite admit what it's doing, that the Office of Science and Technology Policy has become a champion of the idea that we do need a technology policy.
Thank you very much, Bob. Give you a chance to comment. I hope it's not too great length because I'm worried about our questioners.
Let me make just a few brief comments. First of all, I'm not going to take too much argument with any of my colleagues here. Particularly, I agree with what Ash Carter has said, that we tend to give far, far too much attention in this country to revolutionary developments, to the Nobel Prize type development, and not nearly enough to evolutionary ones. The kind of change that gets you a product to market a little faster, a little more reliably, a little cheaper, and gets you market share. And our reward structure throughout the whole system, in industry, in universities, in government, it has to be restructured in this respect. And I think also we have a forgotten middle in the education system, that we tend to look down on technicians. We tend to act as though they've been kicked or fell off the academic ladder prematurely. If they really were any good, they would have gone ahead. And we forget that these are the people that have to make our system work. And our international competitors have been very much aware of this and have given them the kind of respect, the kind of recognition, and the kind of financial reward that they deserve. We only put 2.4% of our federal support into the two-year colleges, where most of these people come from, and that's a mistake that we have to really correct. I am afraid that I would differ with Ash about the future of Sematech and the potential of Sematech, but that's not the first time we've differed on that, and we'll probably differ in the future. I don't want to argue about it this evening. I think Linda's points are excellent. I am one of the really strong supporters of internationalization of a great many of our activities. The time has come when not only do we have to be much more sensitive to our relations with our international colleagues worldwide, but we have to work out ways in which we can work together to solve truly global problems. Probably the one that's at the top of the political agenda at the moment is that of global change, global climate change, that I've been very much involved in. And I want to emphasize that I am convinced that we benefit enormously from the openness that we have pioneered in both science, basic science, and in technology. And I want to keep it that way. And I want to minimize the number of things that are very important to us that we really want to protect those, and be completely open on the rest. Because there's no way that we can protect a whole mess of technology. What we have to do instead is be sure that in our negotiations with other nations, we get some reciprocal benefits. We can do that if we, in fact, are better informed and do our homework more assiduously and are more better prepared for our negotiations, and I think we will. With respect to Mr. Kutner's remarks, if I have the choice of being either devious or irrelevant, I'll go for devious anytime. I think that, however, to be fair about it, that Boskin, Sununu, and Darman are perhaps not quite as much of the black hat guys as they have been painted. And although I will admit that Mike Boskin did once say that what the hell, you know, $100 worth of potato chips, $100 worth of computer chips, it's $100, who cares? He would not say that now. There has been a marked educational process underway. And let me also say that we have really made substantial changes in our COCOM regulations. It really made no damn sense whatsoever for us to try to protect 386 type technology when you could back a truck up to your German Radio Shack and load the thing up and drive east all the way to Vladivostok, dumping it off as you go. So what we have done is to eliminate a whole, let's say something like 85% of all the items on the list. We're not going to worry about those anymore, but we are going to protect some things that are critically important to us. And I would emphasize that at the behest of the Congress, intellectual property rights are now a vital annex to every agreement into which we enter with any nation. And we have negotiated those in a very tough fashion, and within the last 2 months, we have simply blocked something like 20 agreements that were proposed by other countries because they simply refused to agree to our statement of what we recognized as appropriate intellectual property rights. We've tried without success to educate a lot of countries to understand that it in the long run is in their interest to have appropriate IPR protection for their growing industries. We haven't succeeded, but we're taking this very seriously, and we will continue to do that. And I would only say that all of the points that have been raised by my colleagues are certainly important ones, ones that we take very seriously, and ones that we in the administration, certainly in my office, look forward to working with groups like this to try and resolve. They're all important ones.
Thank you very much, Alan. Question period. If you'd like to ask a question, I'd appreciate it if you'd come to one of the microphones so that we can hear you. Let's start over here with Harvey Feinberg.
Thank you very much, Lou. I'd like to ask Dr. Bromley if he might elaborate on a comment made almost in passing in your brief discussion of technology transfer. You said, I think, that true technology transfer occurs in the minds of individuals. One inference that could be drawn from that comment is that we need to do a much better job of creating opportunities for individuals to rotate across industry and between and among industry, government, and universities. If that's a correct inference, I wonder if you might comment on ways that you see to make that more of a reality.
The inference is entirely correct, and there are already in place now a whole series of approaches that we're trying to develop with a number of the major industries, with the national laboratories, and with many universities. There is nothing that works better than to have a senior industrialist spend a few weeks on a university campus to kill stereotypes. And it is incredibly important, in my view, to have groups of industrialists and university folk and federal lab folk sitting down to discuss and decide what the appropriate allocation of available funding, particularly in the national labs, should be in the coming years. We haven't had that in the past, but we're beginning to develop it. It's happening now in the DOE labs. It's beginning to happen in the DOD labs. And I think it can make a tremendous difference if the potential customers are present at the creation rather than at the launching.
Thank you, Alan. Question from over here.
I would like to bring it down from the abstract level to the concrete individual student who becomes a scientist. You touched, Mr. Bromley, the question of the importance of basic science. Japanese get it from us, but if we won't have it, there'll be nobody to get it from. There can be no applied science technology without basic science. And you touch upon education. Now, you're aware, of course, that several people connect with the National Science Foundation. A graduate student in science receives, up to the last year of graduate school, I know one in Yale University, matter of fact, graduate of this university, in physics, now in biology, $11,000 stipend from National Science Foundation. For postdoctoral studies, it's National Institute of Health, the basis of biological basis of biotechnology, is $18,000. I know people same age, less good training, less good universities, making $50,000, $100,000 in business and industry. And this is what results in lots of, maybe it's a good idea, lots of foreign students coming here because that money means more to them. But we are in the process of self-destruct. And I wonder if you could explain how come $11,000? I have a modest suggestion which may help you in Washington. Perhaps it could be attached to salaries of congressmen. For example, 20% for graduate student, graduate of this university, 30% of a postdoc, and maybe when you become assistant professor, maybe 40% of that of congressmen. Maybe this would help. But I would like you...
May I begin by saying that there are too damn many things already tied to the salary of congressmen. But your point about the salary of students, the stipends of students, is, of course, a well-taken one. The fact is that we are spending more now and supporting more students than we ever have before. And you may say we're not supporting them well enough, and I would even agree with you. But the fact is that with the available funding we have the difficult decision of whether to support fewer more handsomely or to spread the funding around. And the decision as to what salary is paid to graduate students is not made by the NSF. It is rather made by the individual universities. And there is quite a range, in fact, depending upon the university in question. And so I think you have to remember that, as Linda said earlier, and I would emphasize right now, we are very much playing a zero-sum game in constant dollars, and we will be doing it for the next several years because of the budget agreement that was just completed. This is the first time in the history of this nation that we are playing a zero-sum game. And so the only way in which we can substantially increase the funding for science and technology is by developing a constituency that will make it possible for us to move funding from other areas of the domestic discretionary budget. You can't touch the military, you can't touch international, you can't touch entitlements. Those are separate categories of the budget that within this agreement are not interchangeable. And so I have to say that all of us constitute one of the least effective constituencies that interacts with the federal government. And I simply have been doing it all over the country, and I do it here. Plead for your help to develop the kind of constituency that will convince Congress. Because after all, the President simply proposes. The Congress appropriates. And we have to convince the Congress that in fact this appropriation is one of the very good investments they can make. And the only way we can do that is if individuals like you here in the room tonight are prepared to take the time to talk to your representatives and to your senators and tell them, not when you want something for yourselves, because it's wildly important for you to go when you don't want something for yourself. First of all, they will be amazed, and they will sit on the edge of their chair waiting for the shoe to drop when you tell them what you want. And if you don't do it, they'll remember you for years. And if you emphasize your concerns about the national well-being, they will listen to them.
Thank you, Alan. Next question from over here.
Dr. Bromley, this is about commercial technology. My name is Robert Hefner, and I'm in the natural gas industry, so you'll see I have a vested interest in the question. But before I get to it, let me make a point or two about the Gulf War. Certainly the world, and particularly we Americans, agree that the Gulf War proved our technological superiority, our technological capabilities. And there's no question that the war was about a lot more than oil. It was about law and the New World Order, sovereignty, and other things like that. But I submit that it was because of oil. We had no choice to go to war there and then because of oil. And we went to war really not because we used too much energy in this country, but because we used too much oil in this country. Being in the natural gas business, I know that the country is awash in natural gas. It's a clean domestic fuel. The technology is on the verge, I think, of being able to replace gasoline with natural gas vehicles. I think that at least we in the industry believe that by the end of the decade we could replace half the vehicle fleet with natural gas technology, natural gas vehicles, and eliminate at least half of our foreign oil. Why then isn't there a re-emphasis on natural gas technology research and development in the budget? As I understand it, there's little or nothing for that technology.
Well, first of all, let me disagree with you strongly. We did not go to war in the Gulf because of petroleum. We went because the President was and is firmly convinced that we had no option if, in fact, we are to look forward to a world at peace and to a new world order that we as Americans could be proud to be part of. But having said that, the question of energy dependence is, of course, a crucial question. I think you've probably seen the National Energy Strategy. You may not like it, but in fact, that has recently been issued by the President, developed by Jim Watkins of the Department of Energy with help from a lot of us, and it does have as one of its primary goals the reduction of our dependence on foreign oil. And it does that through a number of avenues of development, avenues of regulation. First of all, there is a major section having to do with the incentives and the regulations requiring use of alternate fuels. Natural gas is one. Electrical vehicles is another important one. We're within a factor of 2 in terms of energy density of being able to have quite commercially viable electrical vehicles. And my own feeling, and I'm quite open about it, is that this nation, not only because of our need to reduce dependence on foreign oil, but because of our need to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, requires that we develop a new generation of nuclear reactors and that we implement them. I recognize that there is no way that we can expect our public to accept the old technologies, the old approaches, but new technologies are on the horizon right now. They've been developed in Europe and they've been demonstrated in Europe that are, quote, intrinsically safe, unquote. I don't like the term, but we have, in fact, a major program underway, and clearly we have need to use our natural gas. But one of the problems with natural gas, let me just make clear, is that when you do, as many people suggest, change from coal to natural gas, for example, to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, you have to be extraordinarily careful, because since methane is so much more effective molecule by molecule as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide, unless you are very careful about leaks in your plant, you may end up making the situation actually worse rather than better. So these are not simple issues, and it is clear that we should use our natural gas because it's one of the it is the cleanest source of energy we have, without question. But it is not the only alternative, and we have no alternative because we've frittered away so much of our lead time, but to use all the alternatives that are available to us.
Thank you.
Let's see. I come from that factory down the Charles called MIT, and I'm an emeritus professor, so I'm not asking for anything. But your comments and outline of your proposals, I thought were interesting and encouraging. There's a but, of course, and the but is that you talk about industrial policy or industrial technology, and that's obviously an important and essential and necessary and all that. However, there's a large area of, let me call it, civil technology, whether it has to do with landfills or water or the infrastructure of our cities, whatever. As an example, our building industry annually spends, I guess in excess of $100 billion. Its research is measured in a small fraction of a percent. There is no organized effort by the industry, which is largely small. We don't have any giant industries of building, and we as a country, as a society, desperately need to fix all these things that industry doesn't do. And I didn't hear that in your message.
No, you didn't hear it. I didn't touch on that, but let me assure you that Jack Kemp, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, is very much aware of the facts you've just mentioned. It's a bit of a scandal that we don't, in fact, put more research in behind the whole question of the building industry. We have terrible problems in our urban centers, and it is Jack's intent, in fact he's already doing it, to put very substantial new funds into the kind of research that you are discussing, to try and develop within Housing and Urban Development as an agency the kind of technical capability that has been sadly lacking in the past. So I agree that we have a very serious problem. All I would say is that we are addressing it, and we have a very aggressive champion behind it.
Alan, that's the answer I would have expected from a Democrat. Because
us scientists are apolitical.
Because, as he points out, in Japan, the construction agencies engage extensively in R&D, which accounts indeed why a Japanese company built IBM's latest semiconductor plant, because they did the R&D at their expense on how to build the clean facilities better than anybody could. So I would have thought that the administration's answer would be some kind of strategy for how to induce our building industry to get itself structured and start making its own investments to create a technical capability, rather than having Jack Kemp's department take the money away from the homeless and put it into building technology.
We would put it somewhat differently.
Let's take two more questions and then we have to stop. Over here.
Hi. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I wanted to ask Dr. Bromley a question regarding what appeared to me to be two contradictions in the speech you gave. And first of all, I just want to say I appreciate... Well, the first one is you acknowledge the importance of this area between basic science research and the actual application of the implementation of these new breakthroughs into manufacturing, etc. And I think that's widely recognized as one of the important areas of focus for this country. However, it seems that the most dramatic changes in government policy right now are in increasing the budgets of basic science research, i.e. the same old thing. I mean, there have been some programs And I happen to be studying one of them right now, the Advanced Technology Program, which you spoke of. But receiving $10 million in comparison to the multi-billion dollars of basic science research increase, it would seem to me that the priorities in terms of actual government budgetary commitments reflect the old model. And it's the second contradiction I wanted you to speak to is one thing that's interesting is you mentioned that you don't see the government as having an appropriate role picking winners and losers and saying which technology should be pursued. At the same time, however, a commission or committee within your office is giving forth a report on critical technologies. It seems like sooner or later you have to say, yes, these are the technologies that we think are important, or these are the technologies that the Advanced Technology Program is going to fund. Sooner or later the government or the industry representatives that the government is hiring to do its reviews of these proposals is making a choice. And I wanted to see if you could explain or elaborate a little bit more on that.
All right. Let me respond to the first one first. I think your numbers are wrong. First of all, we have requested an 8% increase for basic research and a 14% increase for applied research in the 92 budget. So that does, in fact, at least tilt in the right direction. Secondly, with respect to the critical technologies, there's no question we're making decisions. That's precisely what we're doing. In terms of selecting technologies with the help of a panel that is a mixed private sector, federal government constitution, but that's wildly different from an industrial policy. In an industrial policy, we would go out in a particular sector of the industry, the automobile industry, for example, and decide that we wanted to bail out Chrysler rather than help Ford, or take any other area that you would care to mention. In the computer industry, that we would decide that Hewlett-Packard was more worthy than digital, and that we would help them out. We're not going to do that sort of thing. That's what we define as industrial policy. But in terms of picking generic technologies that are important across a broad spectrum of industries, and also not only in terms of economic competitiveness, but in terms of national security, that is clearly something that falls within our purview. That is something that the President has stated on at least half a dozen occasions in the last 6 months he views as an important role for his administration. We will do it. We are happy to do it. We're proud to do it.
Very good. Can I just follow that up real quick by saying, if me as a taxpayer, if I happen to be a part of an industry that does not get selected as being important, you're saying the distinction is company by company versus industry by industry. What then what are you going to tell me as a person whose industry was not selected as critical? Or
I'm not selecting industries one way or the other. I'm talking about technologies which may be useful to an industry, but I'm certainly not selecting an industry.
Last question over here.
Dr. Bromley, you mentioned economic impact and value to the taxpayers and value to U.S. competitiveness in your remarks. And Ash Carter today asked us a question in terms of funding and as it relates to how do you know that the benefits of U.S. government money as it's handed out will redound to the benefit of the American economy, and how do you choose what companies would meet a definition of sort of under that rubric. And I wasn't sure Professor Carter was overly impressed with my attempt to answer the question today, so I thought I would enlist your comments this evening.
Class.
That's a sneaky way to do homework, but let me try to answer it. First of all, I think that it is very important to keep in mind that we have never intended that our support of basic research would benefit only Americans. The whole philosophy of American support of basic research, in fact of all basic research, is that it is open to everyone. In fact, it doesn't become science until it becomes public information, available to anyone. And the same is in large measure true of the generic technologies until they get very close to the competitive phase. We gain much more than we would lose by keeping that openness, by having the work that we do generally available. What I said earlier, though, is very important. In those areas where we do not define the frontiers, we have to be close enough to the frontiers so that we can exploit without delay developments, discoveries, new ideas, wherever and whenever they occur. And so nothing whatever would be more counterproductive, in my view, than for us to try and draw close boundaries around the benefits that would flow from the funding that we do from the federal government.
So you would say that programs like ATP or other programs you think should be open to any company?
I would, in fact, be perfectly happy to see participation in the ATP programs from in consortia that had non-American members, but I would, of course, be somewhat distressed if I found out that Hitachi was hogging most of the output from the ATP program. So there's a certain amount of common sense that's involved, but I think it would be very counterproductive for us to try and draw any sharp protective boundaries. We saw a marvelous illustration of this. My predecessor, Bill Graham, made the terrible mistake once of trying to hold a meeting on high-temperature superconductivity, where he decided that he would not permit anyone other than a bona fide American citizen to attend. And it was one of the largest rhubarbs of that particular year. No way am I going to get into that one. And I fundamentally do believe that one of our major strengths has been the openness of our system, and I want to do everything I can to keep it that way.
Thank you very much, Alan, and members of the panel. I think it's been a most fruitful evening, and I greatly appreciate it.